look forward to hearing from you in the next 10, 15 minutes, and perhaps we have 1 or 2 questions before we then move into the next panel. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Kilanda, dear Magnus, for this introduction. Colleagues, friends, I want to start by thanking the Center for Human Rights and all the organizers of this global campus for inviting me to join what is arguably an impressive panel to discuss issues around internal displacement. Of course, as I was asked to speak, Magnus generously offered that I speak on a topic of my choice. And while acknowledging that the focus of this global campus is on internal displacement, I still felt that in light of the challenges of today, it would be appropriate for me to share with you some insight on the issues that are related to refugees. And I would like to take the next 15 minutes to speak to you about the global protection of refugees, development and challenges since the adoption of the Global Compact on Refugees. Dear colleagues, dear friends, distinguished participants, some 7 years ago, in 2015, more than 1 million people arrived on European shores within a year. Over 75% of those had fled conflict and persecution in Syria, Afghanistan, or Iraq. European states responded to that crisis mostly unilaterally, leaving much of the burden to a few countries of first arrival and destination that were quickly overwhelmed. The refugee protection crisis, which resulted from such a fragmented response, has contributed to the perception among some in Europe that the global asylum system was broken. An estimated 3,550 persons died during the perilous land and sea journey that year. These avoidable deaths included that of 3-year-old Aylan Kurdi. The inert body of this child washed up on the Turkish beach after a failed attempt to reach Greece came to personify the human tragedies of the 2015 refugee protection crisis. This situation, together with the calls for solutions from developing countries that have hosted for many years the largest number of refugees, led to an unprecedented engagement of the global community that culminated in the adoption of the Global Compact on Refugees by the UN General Assembly in December 2018. The Global Compact on Refugees is a framework for a more predictable and equitable responsibility sharing for asylum seekers and refugees, which aim to achieve 4 specific objectives. First, to ease the pressure on host countries. Second, to enhance refugee self-reliance. Third, to expand access to third country solutions. And fourth, to support the conditions in countries of origin for the safe and dignified return of those who have fled. Some 4 years after the affirmation of the Global Compact on Refugees, the escalation of the Ukraine crisis with the Russian invasion of February 2022 has forced some 6 million people to flee the country. This is the largest number of people forced to flee in such a short period of time since World War II. But the situation in Ukraine should not make us lose sight of the global challenges for refugee protection that we are facing across the world. Last week, UNHCR announced that a record 100 million people have been forcibly displaced worldwide. This, of course, includes internally displaced persons. This situation is due, among others, to new waves of violence and protracted conflict in countries such as Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, Myanmar, Nigeria, Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and of course, Ukraine. The majority of people fleeing persecution are still hosted in low and middle income countries. They do not have the means to properly care for the large influx of people arriving on their territory. As a result, many refugees survive under substandard conditions with limited opportunities to become self-reliant or to start their lives. Return for many refugees is a distant dream due to the protracted nature of many conflicts and crises. Pushbacks at sea and death in the Mediterranean and along other maritime routes is a reality for many. At the same time, we see examples of countries that are pursuing agreements to shift responsibility for protection rather than ensuring responsibility sharing in the spirit of the Global Compact on Refugees. In such a context, one may ask whether the world has lived up to the hopes and ambitions of the Global Compact on Refugees. How far have we progressed since December 2018 in our global commitment to advance protection and solutions for refugees? To arrive at this assessment, we require interrogating some of the progress that we've made since 2018. The Global Compact on Refugee indeed did establish a framework for a predictable and more equitable responsibility sharing, recognizing that a sustainable solution to refugee situations cannot be achieved without international cooperation. The GCR is grounded in the spirit and the letter of the 1951 Refugee Convention, which recognized in its preamble that the grant of the right of asylum may place unduly heavy burden on certain countries, and that a satisfactory solution of a problem of which the United Nations has recognized the international scope and nature cannot therefore be achieved without international cooperation. The adoption of the Global Compact on Refugees was followed in December 2019 by the first Global Refugee Forum, during which states committed to take a number of measures to advance the objective of the GCR. Today, 4 years on, here are the results that we have. In relation to the objective of easing the pressure on host countries, UNHCR, through its Global Indicator Report, has noted an increase in the volume of bilateral official development assistance to lower income hosting refugee countries. From 2015 to 2016, bilateral ODAs to refugee situation in developing countries increased by 23%. On the objective of enhancing self-reliance, UNHCR reported that 3 out of 4 refugees have access to work in the law. Out of 12 million refugees covered by a UNHCR mapping of national legislation, 8.4 million have either full or partial access to key attributes of decent work. However, in practice, fewer refugees have access to employment because of high unemployment rates, informal economies, and the socioeconomic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. On the objective of solutions for refugees, more refugees today have achieved durable solution than in 2016. However, due to the rise in the number of refugees, 16 million refugees were still in protracted situation in 2020, and only 1 in 100 refugees found a lasting situation. So while we recognize the achievement that we've made since the launch of the Global Compact on Refugees, there is an urgent need for the global community to scale up our efforts towards more and equitable burden and responsibility sharing. And of course, if there is a situation that illustrates today the spirit of burden and responsibility sharing, it is certainly the European response to the refugee crisis in Ukraine. UNHCR has welcomed the unprecedented decision by the European Union to offer temporary protection to refugees fleeing Ukraine. The response of European states to the Ukraine emergency has been truly exemplary. It has shown to the world that in situations of massive influx, we can find solutions. But again, such solutions are only possible where states are willing to cooperate and to coordinate. Such solutions are only possible when states are willing to place dignity and protection first. Such solutions are possible when the humanity of asylum seekers and refugees prevails over the color of their eyes or the divinity that they worship. Indeed, early reports of discrimination against non-Ukrainian nationals fleeing the countries and barriers to access to safety for Africans and others in European countries raised serious concern at the beginning of the European response to the Ukrainian crisis. These practices remind us all that true solidarity for all those fleeing persecution remains limited. While the situation in Ukraine has captured global attention, we must not forget that 18 million plus people, including women, children, who have been forced to flee across the world, are still seeking and expecting solutions. We must not forget those fleeing Afghanistan, Syria, Venezuela, or Ethiopia. Afghanistan, for instance, faces one of the world's most rapidly growing humanitarian crises. While the conflict has subdued, violence, fear, and deprivation continue to force many Afghans to seek safety and asylum across the borders, particularly in Iran and Pakistan. More than 6 million Afghans are today hosted in neighboring countries. Yet, burden and responsibility sharing with the countries that are hosting Afghan refugees remain extremely limited. At the very moment when we are seeing such amazing solidarity for those fleeing Ukraine, some states are pursuing measures unilaterally or in cooperation with other states, which are intended to prevent asylum seekers and refugees from reaching their territories. These measures that are designed to shift responsibility rather than to share it are contrary to the 1951 Refugee Convention. UNHCR has expressed great concern about recent proposals from the UK to send asylum seekers to Rwanda and similar proposals from Denmark in 2021. Dear colleagues, dear friends, asylum seekers and refugees face multiple challenges in the enjoyment of the human right, including the right to health, to education, and to employment. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've all seen that refugees were at increased risk of infection, yet were among those forgotten in our national responses. In many parts of the world, including in Africa, climate change and natural disasters are exacerbating tensions and conflict and multiplying the vulnerability of already fragile populations. For instance, violence over the control of water resources in the Lake Chad Basin in northern Cameroon led to the displacement of over 40,000 people to neighboring Chad in a matter of a few days in December 2021. These situations call for renewed policy and humanitarian responses, including in relation to the applicability of the global and regional refugee instrument and other instruments to ensure the effective protection of those displaced due to climate change and natural disasters. To conclude, I would like to stress that the world has made progress since 2018 towards the achievement of global responsibility and burden sharing. But this progress remains minimal and insufficient in the face of the global challenges that we are confronted with. While we've seen some truly exemplary responses to some of the challenges of refugee situation that we are confronted with in the world, we are extremely concerned with the possible emergence of a two-tier global protection regime for refugees, with some who are welcome and others who are forgotten. And UNHCR remains committed to continuing advancing the protection of refugees. And I hope that these few words and presentation were useful to you in understanding some of the challenges that we are confronted with today in the protection of refugees worldwide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Patrick, for those insights and for highlighting the importance of international solidarity. I guess I mean many IDPs also stay as IDPs because this international solidarity is not always available to make them cross borders. Is there any quick question to Patrick? Yes, we have from Cecilia Jimenez, the Special Rapporteur on IDPs. Let's see if we can hear from which microphone here. Yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi Patrick, this is Cecilia Jimenez.
Hi Cecilia.
Hi, good to hear you again. And I would like to get your reflections on how the UNHCR has progressed in the implementation of your IDP policy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cecilia, for this question. Of course, UNHCR remains extremely committed to supporting protection and solution of IDPs and other people who are facing the challenges of protection within their own borders. And of course, as you mentioned, UNHCR has a very strong and forward-looking IDP policy, which is being implemented through our participation and leadership of the Global Protection Cluster in the countries, in a number of countries across the world, but also through our leadership in a number of areas relating to IDPs, including on shelter, as well as on communication and other aspects related to protection. Of course, Cecilia, you work very closely with many of our colleagues who are leading this work at UNHCR. We recognize that as a global community, we are far from meeting the needs that we are confronted with. But certainly UNHCR remains committed to advancing its policy in this area and to moving the solutions and protection for internally displaced persons forward.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Our program is quite tight, so I think we'll move on now. So we have our panel members. So we have Faith and Manfred here, and being joined by and I think it's just Veronica, just behind. I mean, you can also join us just down here. And Teddy, if you join over here, Dr. Teddy Atim is our research coordinator for this global classroom, liaising with all our regional coordinators about their research and so forth. And she will also lead our student discussions now during the week. Dr. Atim has her undergraduate degree from one of our partner universities, Makerere University in Uganda, and then gone further afield to the US and Netherlands for postgraduate studies, but has remained very committed to engagement with Ugandan issues, vulnerability in the context of armed conflict, and also looked at issues around Africa in relation to these issues. She will chair our first panel here. You should also see if we have Dr. Sima Samar online. To mention that she's currently done. Oh, okay, good, very good, and very good. Good morning to Dr. Samar, who is in the United States. So it's quite early there, but I'll hand over to Teddy to take us through this panel.
Thank you, Magnus, for the introduction. We're going to have a panel for speakers. One of us will be online. That is Samar, who is based in the United States. And this panel is mainly going to focus on the issue of internal displacement and conflict in various contexts. And I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for today. Of course, we'll have Sima Samar, who is the Rights Livelihood Laureate based at the United Nations High Level Panel on internal displacement, who will be speaking to us online. And other speaker will be Manfred Nowak, the Global Campus Secretary General, who is here with us in person. And we'll also be hearing from Veronica Gomez, the President of the Global Campus, who we already heard from yesterday. And our last speaker will be Faith Mabera from the Institute for Global Dialogue. So you're all welcome to speak to us today. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Sima to take the floor, because I know it's very early for you to be up, but we're grateful that you gave us the time to speak to us today. Sima, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning. I'm sorry that I joined later. But thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. First of all, I was said that I should speak about the people who are displaced from, or internal displaced person. As you know, that the Secretary General in 2020 established a panel to look at the situation of the people who are internally displaced. I mean, the people who are displaced either in their country, So within their boundary wall of their country, they're called internally displaced person. But the one who are forced to leave their country, that's of course they're refugees. Towards 2020, when we start our as a panel or work, and the first meeting was at the beginning of 2020, and then we had a long plan to go to different countries who are suffering from IDPs. I think every country suffers from IDP, but the number, the level of the numbers who are displaced is different. In some countries, it's much more. In some countries, it's less people who are displaced. But unfortunately, the pandemic hit, but we were able to reach almost to every corner of the places, including Ukraine. We had few meetings with the Ukrainians because they had the IDPs from Crimea, from that place which was already taken by the USSR. So towards the end of 2020, 55 million people were displaced. 55 million people. Although I have to say that most probably it will be much more, because data is not always perfect, because in some of the countries, the people do not even say that they are displaced. So nobody reached to those corner of the country to say, to count them as a displaced person, but they are this internally displaced person. Friends, it's very easy to say that 55 million people are displaced, but I have to say that it is 55 million suffering, 55 million people who are forced to leave their house, poor or rich. And what is the reason of the displacement? You all know that the main reason of displacement is always conflict, because they are really push the people massively to be displaced. For example, in my country, not before the collapse of the government, we had around 4 to 4.5 million people who were displaced because of the conflict in different parts of the country, and because of the drought. The second reason of course, conflict is causing massive displacement. You can see that in Syria, you can see that in Yemen, you can see in South Sudan, you can see in Mali, you can see in Nigeria with Boko Haram, you can see in Iraq, and I clearly see in my own country because I'm coming from a conflict country. And this is 50 millions. I mean, I believe that it's much more. I personally think might reach to the 60 million people, because again, we don't have the exact number of the people who are displaced. By seeing in Afghanistan how the people suffered after the collapse of the government and how people were displaced, I believe, and in Ukraine, you all see every day in the news, it must reach around 60 million or even over 60 million. It's 60 million suffering. It's 60 millions forced displaced. It's 60 millions who are separated from their family. It's 60 million of people of unbelievable stories that they face, and most of them are not told. So we have to look at the IDPs as a people who need help and who are humans. Most of the time, because of the situation, they're not able to live with dignity. They are not, or different organizations, including the humanitarian organization, could not reach them on time in order to give them the survival possibility. What has happened, of course, the most vulnerable people are getting the most heat of the suffering and wound. They lost their children on the way. They lost their elderly on the way. They lost their young women and girls on the way because opportunistic people, criminal groups, they are trying to take hostage, kidnap, and smuggle those youngs, particularly girls and women. Imagine that they lose the access to basic social services. They lose their, if not lose, their education system interrupt. Their health system is entrapped. You can see that they don't have education, proper education, and they don't have a proper access to health services, including reproductive health and including contraception. So that is really more the main impact, and the main suffering is focusing on women, unfortunately. The other issues that we found, I mean, I saw in person myself and during my life, because I've been internally displaced myself, and then I was forced to be refugee myself during the war. And this is third time that I'm forced to be displaced personally. So I know how much is the suffering and how deep is the wound on the life of the people. So the two main reasons people are saying is causing displacement. One is conflict, military conflict. Of course, military conflict, you know, the civilian casualties, the non-respect of international humanitarian and human rights law by the warring faction, and they force people to be displaced, and they are massively displaced. And during that time, as I said, that they lost their loved ones, and they are separated from each other. They don't know. Maybe they don't see each other for years, or maybe they don't see them at all. The second point, the second reason, main reason of the conflict is we call it natural disaster, although it's not natural disaster, it's environment. We call it natural disaster because flooding, because drought, and all these things, the human cause all those. The human destroy the environment. The environment, the global warming, the change on the environment is the cause of another, the main cause of another displacement of the people. So we do have all these problems, but both of them, either conflict or natural disaster, is man-made. We are making it to cause the suffering to the people. But what's happened, I don't want to take a lot of your time. This panel, we were able to have, thanks to technology, to have a meeting with a lot of people, including IDP. From the beginning, we said that should be IDP themselves should be part of the program, so we could come up with a program that it is practical, that it is owned by the people, and find a solution that could change the IDP situation in a positive way, and to reduce the suffering that they are facing. Friends, one other point that I would like to mention, unfortunately, when it's lack of security and lack of stability in the countries, the patriarchy system, male domination, is getting more powerful, is dominating the place. So patriarchy is getting more bolden, I would say, and or encouraged. Then in this case, the violation of women's rights and reduction of, they try to control them, and under the name of the protection, their violation of human rights is happening, and also their freedom are restricted. That's why, as I said, that forced marriage, child marriage is happening because they see the female member of the family as a vulnerable person, so they try to give the responsibility to the others. That is one way. The second reason is usually they sell the young girls for marriage, because to sell the young girls for marriage in order to feed the rest of the family, and it's happening. And also forced prostitution. The problem is that because of lack of access to contraception, this situation create more unsafe abortion and increase the mother and child mortality rates in that kind of environment. So the overall lack of security for women and young girls are increasing in the IDP situation. Lack of privacy, because they are located in a camp, maybe in 10 meter by 10 meter place that they have for their tent or for their muddy house later on they make. So we came up with some recommendation. One of the recommendation is that, of course, the government of that specific country has a responsibility, and they should take the responsibility. In reality, ladies and gentlemen, is that if the government in those countries are responsible, then they would prevent the internally displaced people. So they will not allow the displacement to happen. Unfortunately, they are not either willing or not able to protect. But we should promote their responsibility to protect their own people. That is their responsibility. That's why we are pushing for make the solution nationally owned by the government. It should not be always some group from outside to be responsible for IDPs. By the way, I have to say that all the other, like the refugees have a responsible an institution in the UN, like UNHCR is taking care of that. IOM is another institution which take care of the people who are refugee. But for IDP, no institution is taking them. For 50 or 60 million, no one is responsible. And nobody has, okay, this NGO and that NGO, this part, UNHCR does something, IOM does something, NRC, Norwegian Refugee Council is doing something, Danish Refugee Council is doing something, but it's not a specific institution, global institution that could take the responsibility and provide protection to these kind of people. That's why we are insisting that the government has to take the responsibility. The second point is always political will. Either it's lack of political will in the government they don't have political will because the government is from one ethnic group or from one political party, from one opinion. So they don't really pay attention to the people who are opposing or maybe the IDP group of the people are from the other ethnic group or from the opposition political party. So they don't pay attention and they don't really take the responsibility. Or the government feel responsible. They want to do, but they don't have the resources to support. That two issue, unable and unwilling issue, has to be tackled and push the governments to take the responsibility of their people. The third recommendation is that we have to be ensured that the whole solution is entire to the, belong to the whole society. Belong to the whole society is that include the IDP and also include the host community. Because usually the IDPs, when they establish the camp, they establish the camp in the very poor kind of a rural area, or and outside of the big city, because in the big city there is no space. So of course in the margin of the big cities where more poorer people living, that part will be the IDP camps. When we provide, or anybody provide help and support to IDPs, the local community should be included. Otherwise, we cause conflict in that place. The fourth issue is also, it's important to include the private sector, because the private sector should come up to do something for the IDPs. And it's possible, because if the private sector is included in coming up with creation of job opportunity or any other idea, including establishment of school or clinics and all those kind of an institution or those kind of program, that will help the situation and the condition of the IDPs. So that's why it should, the private institution should be encouraged to start to do something for the IDPs. 5, I think we have to make the United Nations accountable. And should be a particular institution should be given the responsibility. It's cross-cutting. We can't say UNESCO should take it. If UNESCO take the responsibility, they provide the education. We can't say that it's UNDP or WFP should take the responsibility. Yes, WFP should take the responsibility, but WFP only provides some food. And usually also in some of the countries, the program that they establish for IDPs or for the refugees for emergency cases of flooding and so on, which cause IDPs, it's very much male dominated. They don't really see the need and the requirement of the vulnerable group, the whole family. Let me give you one example. For example, they provide this hygienic kit. They were not doing this in 80s and 90s, because I've been refugee and I was working with the refugee. Nobody really paid attention to the needs of women. Now they try to say that hygienic kit. That hygienic kit, for example, has the napkins for menstruation. I'm not saying the hygienic pad, because it's not dirty. That's why I'm saying it's a menstruation kit. So they give Kotex to the women who never used in their life. They don't know what to do with it. So the program should be planned in order to be helpful to the people, in order to enable them to use it to live with dignity. So things like that. First they were not providing, and now they're providing Kotex to the rural, very rural. This I'm talking about Afghanistan, and I think it's same. The case is same in Sudan. The case is same in the rural area of the other countries. So the program should be based on human rights, and it should be to protect the dignity of everyone, including women. The 6th point that we always saying, whatever plan that they are planning for, if it's water resources, if it's the health program, if it's education program, IDP themselves should be consulted and should be involved. Give you an example. If we establish really a school for IDP people in the country, that we should find teachers from the community in that IDP camp, rather than bringing somebody from urban areas. Because the people knows their language, people knows their culture, so they can be more useful in order to, and also creating job opportunity. I just say that as an example for the teachers, but everybody has to look that they should establish a program that could be human rights based, and the IDP themselves should be involved, and the job opportunity should be for the IDPs rather than bringing people from outside, bringing our own friends to get a job opportunity. My time is over.
Yes.
It's only three more things that I should say.
Okay.
Number 8, we should focus on prevention. Friends, prevention of conflict is easy. It is the people of the country should be given the possibility to be part of everything. That means democracy and reduce the discrimination in order to reduce the conflict and reduce the IDP, making IDP. Sustainability of the program, of course, it should not be one-time fix that we give food for one time and then forget about it. At the final issue that I would like to say, all the programs should be based on human rights to protect the dignity of people, not really based on my or somebody else's opinion, and also based on the IDPs should be included on this SDG and all these nice things that we are saying that the world will be even by 2030 with SDG program. Unfortunately, most of the IDPs have not reached to that point. And I thank you so much. I hope it was useful. It is very early, and I rushed to sit beside my computer. It's nice to see you all, and I hope it was useful. I suggest that you all read at least the executive summary of the panel's report. That is on the website. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much. I think you've given us a lot of great learning from the work you've done. And I'm particularly impressed with your focus on centering the needs of IDPs for all of the things that you do and ensuring that it's context appropriate. I think those for me were the key things that came through. So I'll now hand over the floor to Manfred Nowak to give us his reflections on the issue of internal displacement and conflict. Sima, I hope you stay through because we have some moments at the end of the session for questions. So I'm sure the audience might want to ask you some questions. I hope you bear with us. I know it's very late for you. Yeah.
I will say until the end of session.
Great, thank you.
It's fine. I think it's, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
And also those online, Sima, can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
It's very, very good to have you with us in this discussion on internally displaced persons. I would like, and Cecilia Jimenez has yesterday already given you some oral statistics. I just give you a few slides at the beginning, and then I talk a little bit about kind of the guiding principles and why we actually need them. So if you see it, and this is until the end of 2020 by UNHCR, that you see the total number of forced displacement, and that includes the majority, the green ones are the IDPs. That was at the end of 2020, about 48 million. Then you have the Palestinian refugees, they are always counted separately by UNRWA, the UNHCR refugees, asylum seekers, and also the Venezuelans displaced abroad. So altogether, we were about at 84 million by the end of 2020. As Patrick has said, and the UNHCR has published it, we are now over 100 million displaced persons worldwide, the big majority being IDPs. Slide doesn't work. The slides don't move anymore. Yeah, it's shared here, but not on the screen. Sorry for that. Now it works. Okay, thanks very much. Perhaps you stay here if there's again. This is by the end of 2021. The number of IDPs was almost 60 million. And if you see the two major reasons, conflict and violence and disasters, if you count the total number of those who are displaced, so we had 59 and 53 millions of them were displaced because of conflict and violence, and only 6 million by disasters. If you then look at the statistics about internal displacement in 1 year, the last year, 2021, you see a totally different number. And that looks at first sight surprising. So it's always the disaster-related displacement that is higher. Also in 2021, 23.7 million, and only, under quotation mark, 14 million by conflict and violence. And Cecilia already explained the reasons that you have more displacement by disasters. And that is, as also Sima Samar has said, today primarily human-made. It is climate-related. We will discuss it also tomorrow. It is was not shared.
No.
Yeah, we now move the camera up a bit so you can see.
You can see a little bit.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. Okay. Does it work?
No, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Figure it out.
Okay, and that means that those persons who are displaced by disasters usually return quite soon. If you think about an earthquake or floods, etc., usually those people can return, whereas those who are displaced by violence and conflicts are protracted displacements. And that you also see here in 2021, the biggest disaster-induced displacements were in China, in the Philippines, whereas more conflict and violence was in Africa and also the Middle East. Here you have the numbers. China, for instance, has the highest number last year with about 6 million, followed by the Philippines. And this is all really disaster related, whereas the third country is Ethiopia, that is again conflict related, similar to the DRC with also 3.5 million. And there you see also the main reasons. If you say armed conflict and violence, of course, most is really wars, really non-international and also international armed conflicts as we now see them in the Ukraine. Of course, the Ukraine is not yet included in these statistics. This is by the end of 2021. We have now about 8 million IDPs within the Ukraine, and we have more than 6 million refugees. So it's altogether 14 million people. It's the biggest refugee and IDP crisis that we have ever seen since the end of World War II. And in relation to disaster related is primarily weather related, it is cyclones and other storms, floods, but also wildfires, as we have seen in so many countries, Australia, etc., drought, landslides, etc. And then you have a much smaller number geophysical, like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and landslides. Now we are focusing most on armed conflict. Again, this 53 million in 2021. And there you see again, more than 3 million people are displaced primarily in Africa, whether it's Ethiopia, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, but also Colombia and Afghanistan and other countries, Syria, of course, in the Middle East. Yeah, that is, you also see a clear rise. So we have seen in the last 10 years about a doubling of the number of both refugees and internally displaced persons, primarily because of conflict. I would like to say also a few words about since when do we have this whole phenomenon of IDPs. If we go back, the first statistics are from 1982, and at that time we had 1.2 million in 11 countries. But that changed, it really changed primarily after the end of the Cold War for various reasons. The one was that during the Cold War, refugees were usually granted asylum, in particular refugees from the Soviet Union and their allies coming and fleeing to Western Europe. But the same was also refugees from Latin America, then Latin American dictatorships in Argentina and Chile, etc. They were welcomed both in the United States, in Mexico, but also in Europe, both in Eastern and Western Europe. So there was no need, really, if you wanted to flee, to remain within your own country, unless you preferred, because of an earthquake, you stayed in the country. After the end of the Cold War, everything changed. There was much less willingness to accept people by migration policies. Until that time, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand were still immigration countries. With the end of the Cold War, that totally changed. The migration policies also in Europe immediately became very restrictive. That meant that many people who were actually migrant used then the asylum procedure, and that was the reason why the asylum laws have been made much, much stricter until more or less impossible for people to legally actually look for asylum. So that's when you cannot leave your country anymore, although you are displaced, you have no other alternative than to find an internal review, and that means being an IDP. And that was also the reason why the Human Rights Commission, the predecessor of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations in 1992, appointed the first, at that time called Special Representative of the Secretary General on internally displaced persons or internal displacement. And that was Francis Deng, a Sudanese expert. And he looked into the causes and consequences, but then he also realized we have to find out what is the legal situation. And a little bit Sima Samar said it now also. For refugees, you have the Geneva Convention and you have UNHCR as the main UN agency dealing with them. For IDPs, there is no convention on the rights of IDPs, and there is no international organization that is responsible to providing assistance to them. Why? Because it's the government that should take care of them. And if UNHCR, for instance, would try to provide assistance, many governments say, no, 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 that's an internal conflict, it's an internal issue, and you actually should not interfere with our own sovereignty. So that's why the Commission requested Francis Deng to come up with a legal framework. There were two. So first we looked, and one was the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute of Human Rights in Vienna, which I founded in '92. So we started to provide a compilation of what are the existing norms that are applicable to IDPs, and the other one was the American Society of International Law. And then this was consolidated into one document, which was called the Compilation and Analysis of Legal Norms in December 1995, sent to the Commission on Human Rights. And on the basis of that, we then drafted the guiding principles. And with me, I mean, there were three people primarily responsible: Walter Kählin, who was then the successor of Francis Deng as the second SISG, Bob Goldman from the American University in Washington, and myself. But of course, in close cooperation with UNHCR, with ICRC, of course, with other humanitarian organizations, NGOs, Oxfam, but also the Brookings Institution, etc. And that was a very, very difficult, but also very, very interesting exercise to really take out from international human rights law, humanitarian law, the main principles, what can be applied and shall be applied and is already applicable to IDPs, and then taking from refugee law what can be applied by analogy. And that was then provided together with a commentary to Francis Deng, and he added it to his report to the Commission on Human Rights in 1998. As Cecilia also said yesterday, these guiding principles, it's a short document, it's 30 principles, is still the main legal framework that has already gained a lot of authority under international law. By Kofi Annan welcomed it, and OCHA, of course, but also the General Assembly, regional organizations, and many states actually incorporated the guiding principles into their domestic laws. And I have a little bit more time, but not much. Just what are the main guiding principles, we heard already a very broad definition, and the definition also includes human-made disasters, and that means also development-induced, so big dams, etc., displacements. And then there are different sectors, and of course, IDPs should enjoy all the same human rights than other people living, because they are citizens of the country where they have been displaced. In reality, they are very often not if it's because of a disaster. There's also major differences. Then usually the government supports them. But if it is ethnic cleansing, as we have seen it in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was there the main reason for the displacement, the government can do very little, because partly it's exactly those who carry out the ethnic cleansing who are responsible, or in genocidal situations like in Rwanda and also in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So the national governments have the major responsibility, and that was the most difficult in drafting the guiding principles. What should we say about the right of IDPs to ask for humanitarian assistance from international organizations? And this is an own principles, and we say that governments at least should provide them access. They should not see this as a friendly act, and as an unimpeded access to IDPs who ask for assistance from international organizations. And we heard from Patrick, of course, that the main organization today is UNHCR. UNHCR has really broadened its mandate from only being a refugee agency also to being an IDP agency. And when you already in the 90s, all the IDPs in Bosnia-Herzegovina were really primarily taken care of by UNHCR, together, of course, with the government. And then there is the right also, that's also very important, right not to be arbitrarily displaced. So that there should be no, and again, ethnic cleansing is the classical situation where the government is responsible for the displacement. Then looking into what are the human rights during displacement, and that is in principle all civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. From the right to life, you shouldn't be, of course, tortured. Very often that's the case during displacement or raped, but also family reunification. So if families are separated, they should try to be put together again. If there are disappearances, as we have seen in so many countries during displacement, they have a right to know what happened to their family members. And of course, economic, social, and cultural rights. Those are the basic needs that you need to provide them with shelter, with some kind of safety, with food, with water, with education, medical services, etc. So these are the basic needs that should be provided by the government. And if the government is not able or willing, then with the assistance of international organizations. And the final point also, that international organizations should assist in the return, resettlement, and reintegration. And that is, of course, a durable solution, that IDPs should be able to return as soon as possible to their original homes, but also should not then be discriminated there. Again, from the Bosnian experience, finally, the refugees, about half of the population was displaced in Bosnia between 1992 and 95. Half of them, again, refugees, the other half IDPs. But then they should, that was the Dayton Peace Agreement, should go back to their original homes. But they were occupied by others. And then they were discriminated against. So it was very, very difficult to really empower IDPs to actually go back to their homes, find a job because they were discriminated. The children find an education that is not the propaganda of the other side, etc. So those are the main rights that IDPs should have. according to the guiding principles. As we have seen in reality, unfortunately, the situation is totally different. We are reaching numbers of IDPs where none of the international organizations are actually able to really deal with them. So I think the main conclusion should be, let's try to reduce as much as possible internal displacement by not launching armed conflicts or other forms of violence, and of course also fighting against climate change, which will become one of the main reasons for refugees and IDPs in the future, unfortunately. Thank you.
Insights and offering us a lot of statistics. I will not take the pleasure to invite Veronica. I'm going to be much strict now with time because we're really behind time. I think 10 minutes, 8 to 10 minutes. It should be done. Thank you.
No problem.
Great.
Thank you. Okay, good morning. I'm going to try and add onto what has been said before, very eloquently, all the data that has been brought to us and all the testimony that has been brought to us. So I'll try not to repeat that. I would like to share with you some thoughts on internal displacement, particularly in the Americas. And I think that some of the elements are going to be very familiar, especially in Africa and Asia, in connection with this topic. First, I would like to say a few words about humanity, displacement, and territory. I feel very self-conscious about this. I am just a lawyer. I can see here my colleague, Ezequiel Fernandez Bravo, who is an anthropologist. And many times that makes me feel very, very envious of his knowledge. But I think it's important to remember all the time that displacement has been a constant in the history of humanity, especially at the very beginning, when we didn't have agriculture, and there was a long period during which the climate was settling in our planet, and mobility was a constant, moving from continent to continent also. But then we started to use agriculture, and that brought fencing, limits, and settlements. And it changed our culture, our way of interacting, our interests, our economies. It changed everything, the way in which we consider territory. So I think it's always useful to go back and to remember this, that the way our relationship with the land is cultural, is economic, has an economic dimension that has not always been the way that it is now. And now we're facing a new era in the Anthropocene, where again, displacement is connected to climate, but in a different way than it was at the very beginning of our life as a species on this planet. I'd like to focus on the Americas because I think it's a special case, but as I said before, there are lots of points of connection with Africa and Asia. And I think we have to think about the last 500 years, mostly. The life-changing event for our continent, which was the contact with European civilization. And that really changed everything. When I was a child in the history books, we used to have a language that now we have removed about discovery, conquest, and colonization that fortunately now is out of our history books and our geography books, but it was very, very much part of our education, at least my generation, when we were children. And that changed our view of who had access right to the land in our continent. And we also had, with the introduction of mining and intensive agriculture in our continent, the introduction of new populations of African descent through the slave trade. That also brought a culture of collective life and property, as the indigenous communities had before the conquest and the discovery, and that they still have today. These are very, very important elements to understand displacement in the Americas. You cannot really understand unless you introduce that dimension about indigenous communities and Afro-descendant communities. In some international instruments, we talk about indigenous and tribal communities. That's a term that is used. So 200 years ago, a little bit more for the United States, but roughly 200 years ago, we had the emergence of the national state. In fact, I think it happened earlier in the Americas than it did in Europe, where there's still empires and kingdoms, etc. This emergence of the national state brought more than ever the boundary and left populations on the wrong side of suddenly on the wrong side of boundaries. Many of the movement, maybe a lot of the mobility that we see, especially in Central America, and that I'm sure our team's going to talk about. In many of those cases, this has to do with that. These populations that used to move freely through Central America.
I cannot hear you.
Okay, thank you. I think the international is we're being spared from this floor. What I mean is, with the national state and the fact that the national state, as we know it, has had to do this balancing act between what it considers to be in the national interest in terms of exploitation of resources for development, and also the recognition of rights over ancestral lands of these communities. And this is a source of a lot of conflict, in our continent, and lots of many important cases that are being resolved by organs of international protection, human rights treaty bodies, etc., etc. The recognition of rights through the acknowledgement brought by international human rights and also in the constitutions, they include the right to circulation, housing, decent conditions of life, and a special relationship with the land. And so this has helped us to use the international protection of human rights to address all of these issues. In this regard, I want to highlight and repeat something, a lot of very important concepts brought by Manfred and also by Cecilia yesterday about the importance of the guiding principles and the importance of and the power of soft law. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that they have been an essential tool during the last 25 years to understand the situation, to provide guidance at the level of domestic law, and also as a parameter for the interpretation of international law, of hard law that is in the treaties, customary law, etc. I could not emphasize that. I cannot emphasize that enough. And you can see it in very important decisions adopted by domestic courts. I want to refer in particular to the Constitutional Court of Colombia and all the work that has been done in terms of protection of displaced communities on the basis of the guiding principles. Manfred mentioned the people that were there. He was one of them at the moment of drawing the guiding principles. He, of course, mentioned Francis Deng and Walter Kaling, and he also mentioned Robert Holman. And precisely today, I wanted to bring an example. But I wanted to bring an example of a case that I documented personally with him, that I think it exemplifies what it means, what the issue means in Latin America. In particular, a topic that was mentioned yesterday, the relationship between land-based commercial endeavors and conflict in South America, particularly in Colombia. And the case I wanted to bring you, you can read it, it's part of the case law of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. It's the case Operación Génesis on the Afro-Descendant communities displaced from the Cacarica River in Colombia. When did this case take place? It started, because with displacement, we're always talking about a process. It started in the second half of the 1990s in the Urabá region of Colombia. Why is this region so important? It's a piece of land that connects Colombia with Panama. And I can't emphasize enough the strategic importance of that piece of land. This is a piece of land that can give you access both to the Atlantic Ocean and to the Pacific Ocean. And it's crisscrossed by rivers. So you can also have access through a maze of rivers in the jungle. So it's of strategic value for all sorts of reasons, many of which have to do with the activity of illegal armed groups, paramilitary groups, guerrillas, etc., perpetrating serious human rights violations in the region, but also for the traffic of illicit substances, weapons, and also is very coveted in agricultural terms, for logging and also for growing oil palm, which has been a curse for the people that live in that region of Colombia. So as the story goes, in 1997, there was an operation, joint operation with the army and the paramilitaries, and they bombarded and they took some communities across some rivers, Amaqui, Durango, but the paramilitaries were pushing through the Cacarica River and they terrorized the communities that lived on the margins of the river. They committed a particularly heinous crime against one of the inhabitants. They killed him, they dismembered his body. The objective was to terrorize the population so that they would move away from the region and they could make use of the land that was so valuable. Following this event, the population was displaced. Hundreds of people, families, especially women and children, were displaced into different areas. Some of them even jumped into a boat and crossed to Panama from crossing the Pacific Ocean. Some of them lived 4 years in some sort of in the city of Turbo, in a sports arena, and that's when they came into contact with the inter-American system during an in-loco visit, and precautionary measures were issued. And then we were facing one of the main challenges, which is how to identify unbelongers. And now there's systems in place. At the moment, there was no registry. So thanks to the action of the international community, the manner in which the guiding principles were used in the very beginning of the resistance helped for domestic legislation to be adopted, and also for treaty bodies such as the Commission and also later the Inter-American Court to understand that it wasn't always possible to identify fully IDPs, but sometimes you had to understand to which categories of persons they belong, and that sometimes there will be reasons why they wouldn't want to be inscribed in a formal registry, because it would mean stigmatization, because it would mean that they would be identified and then targeted for many, many different reasons. So we had to learn to bend domestic law and international law as well to understand how to afford protection to these groups of people that could not necessarily be identified fully. And even the Inter-American Court understands that years later, much later in 2013-14, when finally it issues a judgment on those events. And the judgment not only refers to the extrajudicial execution of Manino Lopez, which was the victim of the violation of the right to life, but also addresses all the issues that have to do with right to territory, to the right to receive assistance and protection from the state, and also the right to collective property that was acknowledged in the Colombian Constitution but had not been enforced. And there's also references to the efforts that have been made at domestic level by the courts to enforce those rights without success. So I recommend it as a very good example. It's a very classic example of displacement, of the connection of economic interests, conflict, and displacement. So I invite you to read it because I think my time has finished. Thank you.
So I'll now leave the floor for Faith, and I hope to keep the time.
Thank you so much. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'll try and keep on time. I'm aware that you're pressed for time. So I know I'm gathered among colleagues who are deeply rooted in the legal profession. I come from a political science, international relations background, but what I'll attempt to do, and I thank my fellow panelists for laying such incredible groundwork, because it means I don't need to delve into the data that's recent data that's been populated about IDPs, as well as the legal framework, particularly in international law and domestic law that has been put there. But in saying that, I think a good starting point for me would be to point out that in this discussion, while we focused on, Patrick started with a focus primarily on migration, and he talked about the Global Compact for Migration, the 1951 Convention, and then we've also touched a bit about a lot on IDPs. But I think there's an important difference that needs to be highlighted in our discussion on IDPs and migration and refugees particularly. And the fact that the IDP question presents to us a very different, I'd say, set challenges. The problem set that's brought by the IDP question, I think, is slightly a bit more nuanced, a bit more different than the problem that's presented by the refugee question. Why do I say this? This is rooted in the key question about when you look at the legal protection frameworks or protocols that are put there for IDPs, it's the question of how do we navigate state consent, particularly. And I think this is where we begin to now look at how to navigate the question, particularly of state sovereignty, the need for state consent when you're implementing regulations and frameworks to do with IDPs, particularly because in the eyes of the law, IDPs then are an issue or are subject to be addressed firmly by the state authorities. When you look at where the chain of responsibility sort of falls on. So it's firmly rooted in this recognition of state responsibility, particularly for IDPs. And I think that presents an interesting set of challenges. The other thing I think that's important to mention when we're talking about legal protection, and thank you, Manfred, because you highlighted the role that Francis Deng played. And I think Francis Deng for me also is interesting because his ideas that grounded the notion of sovereignty as responsibility, and as some of you are aware, the idea of sovereignty as responsibility is one of the antecedents that also was borrowed in articulating sort of mass support and endorsement by states for the responsibility to protect in the 2005 World Summit Outcome document. So when we begin to look at the interface between R2P as a soft law, in the sense that it's still debated in terms of its status, it's not hard law in that sense. So obviously, and also when you look at the interface with this question that we're discussing today about IDPs, I think we need to ask ourselves about how, when we look at R2P, the trajectory, the normative development, the discursive development of R2P, how the debates and how it's, I'd say, normative dynamics that have shaped our thinking about sovereignty, and how to reshape the kind of approach that we have in terms of sovereignty being a grand norm of the international order and the Westphalian order of states. And I think also bringing it closer to home here on the African, for us who are here on the African continent, I think it's also interesting to note how this discussion that I'm trying to now peg in on understanding the interface between R2P and the guiding principles on internally displaced people, I think it's important to look at how it's also been ventilated, how it's been institutionalized and localized in the African sphere. One example is the Great Lakes Convention, which is particularly in that sub-region, you had 11 states focusing particularly on Manfred mentioned it, the idea of prohibiting arbitrary displacement. And then you also had, building on that, the Kampala Convention, which was passed, which is the AU Convention. It was passed in 2009, but it entered into force in 2012. And I think what I want to highlight from those two documents is that in addition to recognizing prohibition on arbitrary displacement, they actually reiterated the equation, the protection of populations against mass atrocity crimes. They had an affirmation of R2P, whether you call R2P a principle or whether you prefer to call it an emerging norm, doesn't matter, but they had an affirmation of R2P in the preamble of those two conventions. And I think this then also begs the question of, so on one hand, yes, you have what I'd say pretty firm footing on your legal framework. Then comes the institutional framework angle. And this is where I think we begin to see a lot of challenges, particularly from an implementation perspective. Because when you look at the institutional frameworks in place, and this has also been touched on, we tend to see preference for the cluster approach, which is what the UN has tended to recourse to, this idea of pulling in resources and responses from a cluster of agencies. That has been the preferred option. But this also raises another set of challenges, because within the cluster approach, there's also questions about whether there's a tendency for it to be too UN focused. There's a tendency for it to maybe sort of create a very marginal role for your local and national actors. So that role is what also needs to be questioned, because that I think is where also a lot of the rubber needs to meet the road. And I think also this particular question about the practical implications and the kind of traction that institutional protection has when it comes to IDP is where we begin to see challenges. That's where, and I think a case that is good in illustrating my point here is when you look at the Darfur case. In fact, a lot of the analysis is there's a plethora of analysis on the Darfur case, but I think a lot of the consensus about the Darfur case study is that it's tended to represent almost what has been labeled as a systemic failure with regard to responding to the IDP question, particularly because it's almost relied on a lot on government circumstances on the ground. It's been driven a lot by government policy responses, and where there's been even presence, there's still a sense that the heavy reliance on the international stakeholders has been done at the expense of whether you want to call it political will or commitment in terms of resources by the national actors. And also talking about the interface with R2P, I think further afield, when you look also at another case study that begins to shed interesting insights on that interface, is the question of the Syrian conflict. And here, I just want to circle back to the question of the state consent that I mentioned earlier. Because when you look at how the UN, for instance, navigated the proliferation of IDPs, but pertinent to the Syrian conflict, what was interesting with the Syrian conflict particularly is that the UN Security Council managed to find a workaround around the consent, the state consent question. So what happened then in 2014, I think I need to get the year right, is that there's a statement, that a presidential statement that was issued that actually provided a workaround around the issue of state consent, moved beyond the requirement to acquire state consent, and actually just centered it around the notion of requirement to notify. So that then gave a bit of headway for your humanitarian agencies to work around the limiting factor of state consent. And also, I think, in the interest of time, I think I want to summarize in three key points, I think, when you're talking about whether there's sufficient backing, one, in terms of legal protection, two, in terms of institutional protection, and what this has in terms of practical implications. I think in the broader context of understanding IDPs, and here I want to focus, I think disasters, yes, one thing, natural disasters, but I think also in the context of armed conflict, it raises interesting questions about the interface between the IDP phenomenon and conflict. And this is particularly because if the structural drivers of the conflict in question were linked, for instance, to competition over scarce resources, or if they were linked to conditions of deprivation by the population in a particular area. And this will complicate, for instance, the question of return, because when IDPs want or are considering returning to their initial areas of habitation, the tension between host communities and IDPs becomes particularly acute in the context of this interrelated drivers or structural drivers of conflict. And I think that's a very interesting interface between the two. And also, I think what makes return a particularly thorny issue is the fact that it's tended also to be mostly politicized. And here I'm talking about when you're moving, for instance, from an armed a situation of active conflict to maybe in the post-conflict episode, we tend to see a politicization of IDPs. And this can be seen in a number of ways. For instance, there's a risk that the returnees might be sort of instrumentalized by political actors in terms of political engineering. So what happens is this phenomenon of, for instance, ethnic stacking where IDPs are routed to a particular region so that, especially if it's elections, so that political actors can gather majority for a stake in the political context. There's also a risk of you're going to generate, I want to say, another facet of conflict also with the returnee question, because you might flare up new tensions where there's contests over land ownership, for instance, or whether there's a very huge political divide. That risks creating almost fueling another cycle of conflict. And thirdly, I think we also need to begin to ask ourselves in the broader ambit of conflict resolution and mediation efforts, for instance, to what extent are we integrating IDPs or the question of internal displacement in the peace efforts? To what extent are the voices of IDPs, the rights of IDPs being filtered or factored into the negotiating table? And even more attending to this question is, how then do we bring their voices onto the table? I think that's another challenge, bringing in the voices of IDPs into peace agreements, and who speaks for them, who's a legitimate voice on the negotiating table. And in conclusion, I think, because yes, I've presented an interesting, a complex array of problems, but I need to leave you with something to think of in terms of a solution-oriented sort of conclusion. So there's been also an increasing turn questioning about whether we can begin to think about addressing some of the gaps in implementation by turning, for instance, to the notion of risk analysis, or turning to the risk of to the tools of forecasting or predictive models, because this can potentially offer an avenue for humanitarian responses to plan their responses ahead of time in terms of garnering the right amount of resources or planning. And actually, IBM and the Danish Refugee Council have done this. They have a predictive modeling, has about 120 indicators. They use patterns and identity patterns and relationships over 25 years, and they use a predictive modeling to actually pinpoint or project the kind of exponential growth that they would likely see in terms of IDPs in a particular area. And that has a positive effect in shaping the response of humanitarian agencies. It's not perfect because there's a lot that needs to be tweaked, but I think it begins to put us on a more, I'd say, optimistic footing in shaping both global and national responses. So I think that's my time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Faith, and all the other speakers. And I think we've had a lot from all our speakers. And key things for me that emerge in terms of recapping our issues of centering IDPs, making sure that our response are context appropriate. And of course, you've just mentioned, highlighted the importance of participation of IDPs in all the process, including peace negotiations. But also, I think the aspect of prevention has come through really strongly in terms of, now you brought in the idea of early warning systems, predictive measures that we can put in place. Yeah, I don't want to go through this because our speakers have been very elaborate. I want to give us about 5 minutes, maybe. No? One or two questions, because we're already really behind time from our audience to our speakers. So if you have any comments or questions, please raise your hand and then we'll we'll get your microphone. Please come forward, maybe. Come forward. If you have any question, we have already one speaker, one person asking a question, another one. Anybody else? None? Okay, great. Oh, somebody else, Zoe. Okay, we have two. Directed to the,
yes.
If you have.
Thank you. My name is Gerald Yakula. Thanks, Faith, for making a point about the AU Convention on Internal Displacement. The work of Novak. So there's no instrument, but in Africa we have this instrument on internal displacement. I think that we learn in terms of the global. That we learn from the global north, learning from Africa on addressing internal displacement. My question now will go to the first speaker. And you talked about your experiences being a victim of displacement herself. I know human rights focuses a lot on vulnerabilities, people that are vulnerable, right? A lot of the people we see are poor people being affected by displacement. My question really is, what about those who are maybe middle class people, rich people and whatnot? Like I said in your presentation, it affects everyone. So do we have interventions that tend to also focus on the impact of displacement on these people who are not so poor but might also be affected by these conflicts, these displacement issues? We both talked about issue about reintegration, returning. Do we also have the efforts by these different agencies aimed at getting victims who are at least better off, who may not be in camps necessarily, or who are also victims of displacement? Do we have any interventions that tend to focus on these other victims that may not be so poor that we don't see the everyday picture?
I think we'll add all the questions, then we'll have the panelists address it.
Okay, thank you very much. I will be very quick, just for say some time. I want to ask a practical question. So we have our research team has started the latest report on internal displacement, and the data is confusing. So some data show that internal displacement happens because of violence and conflict. Then other data says that the most important cause is climate change. So how would you advise the researchers? How should they, overcome the problems with the data available? Do you have any practical tips for our young researchers? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. So I'll leave it to Sima first. Can you address the first question and then the rest will answer for the last one? Sima, can you hear us? Okay.
Hello?
Oh, you're there. Okay, great. We asked you to address the first question. Do you hear us?
I don't know if it's, I don't hear you properly, but I just wanted to mention one point, not to take a lot of time. In all this process, unfortunately, there's not enough accountability and justice for the people who violate the IHL, who force the people who become displaced. So unfortunately, the culture of impunity continues, and we will have more people displaced, as Manfred said about the Ukrainian, but there are a lot of other people who are displaced by conflict and militarization, and also by the environmental degradation. But I think we all have to push for accountability and justice in this regard that I forgot to mention in my speech. And thank you so much. I really it's a pleasure to be part of this program, and I'm sorry that I could not be there with you in person, and I would love to be there in person in your future programs.
Thank you very much for making the time to address us today. We really appreciate you, sitting up until very late, very early in your time in order to speak to us. Thank you. So I'll pass on to the other panelists on the question of how we can navigate between national conflict and conflict. When it comes to the data collection and the meeting, yes, it's important at that level in terms of understanding causal factors, right? I wouldn't discount that count. But I think the more pressing issue of this is the response continue, because that's where the traction and the cut through needs to be followed through. So yes, you can chart your data depending on whether you want to understand what the causal factors are, but I think to pose the question back to you, what difference would that add in terms of shaping a system-wide agenda?
because I think the net effect still remains the same, that it still builds on the numbers, whether it's conflict driven or climate driven. Yes, it's important, but at the end of the day, the net effect remains the same. So I think my own assessment to that would I give more to the other ends of continuing the response because that would be a bit more substantive material effect.
Thank you. Others? You have to ask those who drafted the report first. But let's say that there are elements here. First, you have to ask the question of whether you want to pigeonhole them like that. Because most of them are multi-causal situations. And maybe you want to pigeonhole them in a particular way because you're treating the symptoms. So maybe if you're treating the symptom that is connected with conflict, then the remedies, are going to be a certain kind, and if you're facing climate, will be a different kind. If it has to do with, endeavors and economic interests, maybe. But at the end of the day, if you want to go beyond treating the symptoms of the situation, and you want to address the causes, so that you can really find doable solutions. Agree that the doable solutions are connected with removing the factors that generate this. Those you're going to have to be honest about which the root causes really are. And that's when the pigeonhole becomes a bit complicated. That's what I found with cases I've documented that I've seen around.
Yeah, also short to Zoe's question. I ended also and convinced that in the future, the number of refugees and IDPs because of climate disasters will increase. Nevertheless, having said that, also they are usually not long-term IDPs. Again, if there are more fires and floods and storms, etc., that will be short-term displacements that can, in principle, will be dealt with by the government, feeling also responsible for that. So that I think if you look at the root causes, for me, still, and I mean the increase in armed conflicts during the last 10 or 20 years is amazing, extremely frightening. And I think if we really look at the root causes, that's where we have to start. Those is very, very important, but for the protracted cases, and those are the high number of IDPs, still violence, any form of violence and armed conflicts is the major root cause.
Thank you to all our panelists. Yeah, I think we've come to the end of this session. I know we've taken much more time than we thought, so we apologize for that, but I think we'll try to do it better going forward. So we're going out for break. We should spend 15 minutes. So we expect that to be back here by 4:15. And then we can listen to the presentation from our students, because that's the most important reason that we here, to listen to the students, to support them in their own work, and encourage them to, to be future researchers who will be addressing future ethics like we have before us here. So thank you very much for the time.
Very much, David, for moderating. And I just have 3 announcements before we go for the break. First, those of you who have not yet put your name on the list to the Saturday using so you please come to me and add your name. Secondly, I know it was very cold in here. I've requested for blankets. They unfortunately cannot change the temperature because it's university policy, but they will give us about 20 blankets. So you can fight amongst yourselves, or you'll get the blankets. And then, thirdly, Janet, is Janet here? No. Janet has been talking to some of you, she's there. She has been talking to some of you, and she's organizing an excursion to the Janet Museum, which is part of the university tomorrow afternoon. She's still sorting out the logistics. Entrance is 150 rands per person. But if you want to